Okay, we're ready to start our next session, and we'll turn it over to Jim Poterba.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Jim Poterba. I'm a professor of economics at MIT. I also have the privilege of being the president of the National Bureau of Economic Research. And the NBER has a wide-ranging research program that includes a significant amount of work on the digital economy and the implications of digitization and all that goes with it for labor markets, for product markets, for firms, and for financial markets. And what we've tried to gather today in this first ever session sponsored by the NBER here at NABE Tech, and we're delighted to be here with you. We've tried to collect, in some sense, a potpourri of different types of research that showcase the way in which economists from across the spectrum of different fields are working to study the digital economy and the changes that the digital economy has brought in various contexts. I am thrilled to have three of the leading researchers working in this area to speak this afternoon. The first is Rebecca Diamond from the Stanford Business School, and she'll be talking about the gender earnings gap in the gig economy. She'll be followed by Simone Schaner of USC, who will be talking about building transparency and trust by using voice notification in developing country financial service applications. And finally, by Amit Seru from the Stanford Business School, who'll be talking about the challenges of intermediating houses and evidence from iBuyers. And our plan for the session is that we will begin with Rebecca as the presenter, then Simone and Amit. We will basically work right through the three presentations. Please put questions into chat, and it will take time, as we have at the end, to discuss Q&A on all three of the papers. So Rebecca, the virtual microphone is yours.
Great, thanks very much. Let me pull up my slides. Are we good? You guys see that?
Yep, looks
great. Okay. So thanks for giving me the chance to talk about this work. This is joint work with Cody Cook, a graduate student at Stanford, Jonathan Hall at Uber, John List at UChicago, and Paul Oyer also at Stanford. So we're going to be looking at the gender earning gap in the gig economy through the lens of Uber drivers. So just to motivate a bit, taking a step back, there's a huge literature studying the gender earnings gap going back a number of decades. And as far as where we are today, if you do a simple cross-sectional regression, looking at earnings differences between men and women, depending on exactly what you control for, this number changes a bit, but more or less putting in standard observable differences between men and women, you see that the average female worker earns about 88% per hour of what the typical male worker earns. Now, this gap can be bigger or smaller in different contexts. It's known to be associated with fewer hours, bigger in cases where women have weaker continuity of work, and it gets especially large in middle age. So this gap tends to widen with age. One potential mechanism that's gotten a lot of attention recently is possibly the role of job flexibility. So there may be a penalty in terms of earnings if you work in a particularly flexible job, possibly because workers may be imperfectly substitutable. So if you have to switch between workers a lot, that may not be very efficient in terms of your production. And that might be one of the key reasons women tend to earn less than men. It's because they tend to have a higher demand for flexible work, and maybe that makes them sort of at a productivity disadvantage. If that's a key mechanism at play, then it would suggest that technology change that could make workers more substitutable, that may actually really narrow the gender earnings gap, because it wouldn't be so costly to switch between workers anymore if we had technology to make that more efficient. So the market for gig work is sort of a great place to study hyper flexible labor market earnings, where men and women sort of at first blush have no real differences in terms of access to a flexible workforce. They're going to be doing identical jobs more or less in a very transparent environment. So it's a really unique place to study the gender earnings gap, not only because it's so flexible, but because the data quality is so good. So we can see really, really precisely exactly what task was performed. We know the exact formula of how pay was set. And because everything is so sort of simple and transparent, this sort of ex ante rules out a lot of potential mechanisms driving the gender wage gap. So in many other settings, we know there's evidence that there's big gender differences in willingness to negotiate for pay raises. this potential premium for working long hours, and there may be just direct gender discrimination, just how pay is set. Since pay here is formulaic, sort of we are ruling out all of these forces up front, so we can try to see if there's still a gender pay gap. So this is gonna be a relatively simple analysis. We have earnings data from close to the universe of Uber drivers. We're gonna take log hourly earnings, regress them on a gender dummy, and then add increasingly more controls to try to look at which forces seem to explain the gender dummy. And then if you put enough controls in, we know sort of by definition, because the actual formula of Uber driver pay does not actually use gender, that if you control for enough stuff, mechanically, eventually that effect has to go away. So we can decompose where that effect may be coming from. So you can do this using the whole US of all Uber driver data. That's a huge sample. Starting just looking at weekly earnings, where you don't adjust for hours differences. You see there's a very large gender gap in weekly earnings, where the average man is earning about 41 log points more than the average woman. A very large share of that is coming from just working more hours. So if you then look at hourly earnings, you see a still robust but much smaller gap of between 6 and 7%. Most of our paper is then going to deep dive into the Chicago land area labor market for computational reasons, and things look pretty similar there. We can then start to investigate some of the first hypotheses that might be causing a gender wage gap. So we're going to look at how this wage gap here of Chicago, sort of about 3.5%, changes when you now control for what time of day workers are driving. So you can see that men and women seem to be choosing different hours of work. And that can mitigate about 5 percentage point of the gender wage gap. So some of this potentially could be related to men being more willing to drive the overnight shift, where women more prefer to drive during the day. You can also then control for differences in location. So a geohash here is just a sort of technical term for a neighborhood, what neighborhood the ride picked up in. You can say controlling for which neighborhoods drivers are picking up in. There is an even smaller gender gap, only left over about 2.5%. So there's a good amount of sort of this initial gender wage gap can be explained by differential location choices, and putting them both in together and fully sort of can explain a bit more. But you can see that we can start to chip away at men and women are making different choices in this labor market, where women are choosing times of day to drive that are different, and choosing neighborhoods to pick up in. In the paper, we go into this in more detail, and we can show women are more likely to avoid high crime areas, and they're less willing to pick up in sort of high bar neighborhoods where there might be people who have been drinking. So they're potentially, compensating differentials for these types of disamenities that may be especially valued by women, and that ends up affecting pay. But the biggest force we find is actually differences in driver experience. So this is a plot of the histogram of how many works, the cross section of Uber drivers. So we took all the Uber drivers that drove on a given day or given week in January 2017 and just plotted how much experience do these current drivers have. And you can see the men on the road at any given time are just much more likely to have driven for Uber a lot in the past, where women are much more likely to have driven for only a handful of weeks. So there's this vast underlying experience difference. And it's not just a difference. We just skipped a slide there. Oh dear, okay. There we go, my computer's freaking out. It's not just a difference in just counting of weeks, but even conditional on the number of weeks driven, we see that men are accumulating more trips per week than women. So even if they're sort of on the extensive margin, do you drive this week or not, men are sort of more attached to this labor market, working at more hours per week and completing more trips. So even if you could measure experience in terms of a count of weeks, you're still going to have pretty substantial measurement error, because even conditional on weeks, the number of trips is widening as workers work more and more. So then we can actually look at the role of experience in determining the gender wage gap. Just like any job, the more you do the job, you get better at learning its idiosyncrasies, you get better at learning where to drive, what are the best times of day to avoid traffic or hit a surge multiplier on your compensation, so you're going to get a higher hourly rate. And you can see here controlling for the how much experience drivers have has a huge impact on the gender wage gap. So we started off, remember, around 4%, just controlling for experience knocks it down to just over 1 percentage point. And then you can increasingly add controls for when they drive and where you drive. And you can see that erodes some of this experience effect, which means that some of the things that they're learning about is they're learning about what are the best places to drive, when are the best times of the day to drive. So you get better at targeting the high pay and high productivity hours. So the fact that men just on average have a lot more experience is going to mean that they're sort of targeting sort of the neighborhoods, the times of day, and other margins, like strategically accepting or canceling rides to be able to maximize their pay. And the women are just on average have less experience. And here we have really, really good data on experience, so we can really accurately track those differences. Now, what does this mean for the broader economy? So we know that experience differences likely are pervasive across the all industries and sectors. Here we have this really, really great data. But when you have only mediocre data on experience, which is typical if you're working with a standard sort of public use data set or even administrative data, you often only have how many weeks has this person worked, or maybe all you have is age, that can lead to substantial measurement error in tracking these experience differences. And when you have sort of mismeasurement in experience, workers that work more hours in a given week maybe, is likely to be correlated with working a lot of hours in previous weeks and previous weeks before that. So long hours in a given week is likely to be correlated with this sort of underlying just experience gap we see across these Uber drivers. And that may sort of make it very hard to quantify what is the premium to working long hours in a given week versus what is the premium to have worked many hours over many weeks and gained a bunch of experience. And here, if you have kind of bad data on experience and you try to estimate the job flexibility penalty, so how much do you have to give up in earnings to have a low hours job, it's going to be very hard to disentangle the role of low hours on pay versus the role of experience on pay. And this is a really big difference from a policy perspective. So if if it's really about long hours versus short hours, technology like the gig economy is going to make workers much more substitutable and potentially get rid of a long hours premium because you can now work in teams much easier as you can trade off between workers. But if the fundamental thing is really about differences in long run experience, you can make workers as substitutable as you want. And those fundamental long run experience and productivity differences are still going to remain. So if we want to try to narrow the gender gap between men and women, and we want to think about, how can tech, can facilitate that through technology change, you need technology that can really flatten the learning curve. Find ways that even, when you work a little bit at that given job, you're pretty productive and there's not a lot of nuance to pick up as you work this specific job more and more. Or you just need broader changes in time use and gender norms so that we don't have this underlying force that is pushing women to choose fewer hours in the first place. So I think this Uber data, where we have really precise experience, highlights that there's very policy relevant differences about what could be driving these persistent gender earnings gap, even in a labor market where we don't really think there's per se discrimination or a lot of the other traditional stories. Finally, just to fully close the loop here, we can fully explain the gender pay gap once you control for speed of driving. So if you drive a bit faster, you compete a few more rides per hour, and that's going to lead to higher hourly wages because you just get more done per hour. And it happens to be that men just drive a little bit faster. This is in Uber drivers. You can look in other data like the National Household Travel Survey, and men in there we're just driving to the grocery store are just driving a little bit faster. But once you condition on speed, experience, hours of work, when you drive and where you drive, there's a zero gender gap after that. So we can fully explain it. We can then use a decomposition method. Come on, slides. All right, let's see if it's not going to change. So we can fully decompose the gap into what are the main forces driving it. There we go. So you can see speed is a big explainer of the gap. It explains about 45%, but then experience is another 35. Where you drive is about 30. And when you drive, actually, once you condition on these other three, actually sort of exacerbates the gap. The women are actually choosing sort of on the margin better times of day. Some of this is they're also more willing to drive Sunday afternoons, like when football is on, and those tend to be high pay times a day. And one final thing to note is we can sort of decompose some of these differences in where to drive. So why are they choosing different locations? About 20% actually is due to just different home locations. So people tend to drive where they live, where they start off with, that's where their car is initially. And women on average are living in neighborhoods with lower surge rates, and they tend to pay a bit less. There's also some, as I mentioned before, differences in willingness to target neighborhoods with high crime or a lot of bars. So thanks very much. And I look forward to the next talks.
Okay, Rebecca, thank you very much. And there are a couple of questions in the chat that I will let you pick up at this point, but we will move right on and let Simone present her work on using voice reminders.
No. Okay. Great. Thanks. Hopefully you can hear me and see my slides. It's great to be here. And I changed the title a little bit because I wanted to give you an overview of really a portfolio of projects that I'm working on with a superset of co-authors at work, Duke, Yale, and Harvard, really trying to understand barriers to women's use of digital technologies in India. I'm a development economist, so this is going to be about kind of an emerging economy context. And, you know, I think this is a very exciting area to be working in if you're interested in economic development. There's been a growing body of evidence showing that mobile phones have the potential to reshape the lives of the poor in a lot of really fundamental and exciting ways. You know, access to basic mobile has been growing rapidly. You know, kind of over 2/3 of the world's population has a mobile phone. India, our country of focus, is already the second largest smartphone market in the world. And, you know, only like a third of people have smartphones. So you can kind of see where this is going. We have a lot of good evidence. It's, you know, phones sort of speed the spread of information, improve functioning of markets, and can connect people that otherwise don't have information to valuable information. You know, kind of related to finance, which I'll talk about later, education and health. So this is really exciting. However, when thinking about emerging economies like India, there are major gender gaps in terms of access to mobile. India has one of the largest gender gaps in mobile in the world. I think it's like one of the only countries where less than half of Facebook users are women. I think Facebook has over 300 million accounts in India, and the last numbers I saw, about a quarter of those accounts are owned by women. So this is a major issue. And this is in a context where a lot of Indian women lack economic agency. So these are some just nationally representative statistics from a variety of surveys where you see 87% of women report that they need permission to take a short bus or train trip. Only half say that they could actually go alone on that trip. And only 42% of women report that they have money of their own that they alone decide how to use. So I guess since this is a business conference, I think part of this is a huge market opportunity. Just closing the gap matters for business and for development. If you care about marginalized populations that lack agency, we also think that as the world moves increasingly towards mobile, there's this huge potential to connect women to information and markets that they would not otherwise have access to. But we really need to do something to figure out how to make that work. And so this is just a little bit of a schematic, which is kind of part of a framing paper that we did for one of our donors. When you kind of dig into understanding why women are not using mobile phones, you really see that there's this intersection of economic barriers and restrictive social norms that just make it very hard to kind of break out of the cycle. So you can kind of start with a social norm that says woman's place is within the home. That can lead to exiting the labor market. India also has one of the lowest rates of female labor force participation in the world, so I should take care of the kids. Then it's kind of like, oh, well, I'm just at home taking care of the kids all day. Why would I need a phone? But then that makes it really difficult to understand and adopt new technologies. And so you can kind of see how these things contribute to one another. And so we really kind of think about the work that I'm going to share today as part of this iterative research program that is meant to identify the best ways of kind of breaking the cycle and kind of shifting some of these underlying barriers that lead to these disparities. So the first project I want to talk about, we really just zoomed in on this idea of, well, maybe there's just not a good gendered use case that would encourage women to engage in the technologies. And if we can encourage women to engage with the technology, maybe that'll create positive knock-on effects. And so this is the project about building knowledge and trust with an interactive voice response system. This is a project that we did in rural Madhya Pradesh, kind of working with one of the largest banks in India. And I think an important thing to be aware of is India has really high rates of financial inclusion, in part due to a very ambitious plan to install kind of like village level banking kiosks kind of across the country. Everyone in theory should have access to one of these within 5 kilometers. You can kind of see a picture of those kiosks below. They're small, they're informal. But women don't fully trust the bank kiosks, and in fact, they're kind of there's a lot of perceived gender discrimination at these kiosks. And you can imagine, in our sample, the vast majority of women are in fact completely illiterate. And so you're really relying on this informal operator to truthfully report about where your money is going. This can create barriers to use. So what we did is we developed a phone-based information service to kind of create a use case for women and boost financial engagement. Effectively, what it did is every week, women who we enrolled would get a voice call, which informed them of any deposits that happened within the past week, any withdrawals, as well as the balance. So kind of creating a check on what that kiosk operator might otherwise report. And we evaluated it, just sort of using an RCT again, together with one of these big banks, which generously shared administrative data with us. So the upshot is that the service was popular. It ran for a little under a year, placed over 12,000 unique calls, and over 70% of those calls were picked up. So there is kind of sustained engagement. And you can see that what this does is it sort of shifts kind of dependence on the kiosk agent for balance info. So that's that leftmost graph. Kind of dependence on the kiosk agent for your balance info goes down by like about 10 percentage points. And more women are reporting that they're getting their balance information from a phone call. That goes up by about 20 percentage points. And this also increases kind of the share of women that report that they know how much money is in their bank account. Kind of moving on, we also see that there's kind of a statistically significant increase in sort of reported trust of the agents, both in terms of like how safe the money is there, and how are these guys going to tell me the truth? This is treatment effect in standard deviation units. We see nothing in terms of treatment effects on like the sort of brick and mortar banks, which is where these women would not be going, which kind of tracks with the service. But on the flip side, we don't see any change in account use. So kind of using the administrative data from the bank, or autonomy in terms of are they going to the bank by themselves, or use of mobile phones. So in some sense, I think this is something that worked. It's a sort of very cheap way of increasing trust. But in this setting, that increased trust is not really translating into more meaningful engagement with either the banking system or mobile phones. I think a natural hypothesis here is that part of the issues are lack of economic resources, as well as kind of very restrictive gender norms. It's just like this intervention is just like not quite enough to kind of break through that equilibrium. And so kind of going back to this research question, I want to spend the rest of the time talking about a series of projects that we're building in a different state, the state of Chhattisgarh, that kind of leverage this program called SKY, or Sanchar Kranti Yojana. This was a program that the government of Chhattisgarh ran in 2018 with the goal of distributing smartphones to female heads of households in urban poor and all rural areas within the state. It was a very ambitious program. And effectively what it did is over the course of 2 months in 2018, they distributed almost 3 million phones across the countryside. In this Indian state. The phones were kind of small, low-cost, India-made smartphones. And then alongside the provision of the phone, people got, I think, like a gig of data per month for the first 6 months for free. They sort of preloaded some government apps, and also built 4G LTE towers in all the villages that did not previously have LTE coverage. And in theory, they did some digital literacy training, but I think in practice that part didn't happen. But they did a great job of distributing the phones. We are kind of engaged in evaluating this program in a few different ways. What we have results from now is kind of an event study approach where we were doing a baseline survey for a different project, and we sort of randomized individuals within the sample to just be surveyed effectively either 2 weeks before or 2 weeks after this sky distribution in their community. So if you sort of assume that over the course of 2 to 4 weeks, time effects are minimal, we can do some before after event study analysis, just understand, what, if anything, does this program do in the very, very short run? And then I'll talk a bit more about, what we're going to do to understand the effects of the program in the long run. So the upshot is, as I said, they did a great job of distributing the phones, and it had a massive increase in smartphones. So, kind of prior to the program, about 40% of households said that they had at least one smartphone in the home, and this goes up to almost 100% post distribution. And in fact, for a small share of households, maybe about 5% of households, this is the first phone that they have ever owned. And I think it's kind of fascinating is this is sort of a big part of what we want to engage in with this second piece of the research agenda is the sort of the social norms that limit women's access to phones. I think it's short. I could talk about that for a very long time, but don't really have time, I think, to talk about it in such a short talk. But the baseline is that there's a lot of assumptions that it's not appropriate for women to use phones. And so we did a lot of qualitative research to kind of inform piloting of questions to capture these norms. And in the short term, what we see is that the evidence that the norms, stated beliefs about women's phone use actually shift due to this program. So you can see that kind of the share of respondents who believe that supervised phone use, so phone use, being supervised by your family while using the phone is appropriate, kind of goes from about like 56% of households up to nearly like 76%. So, almost like a 20 percentage point increase in the share that think that type of phone use is appropriate for unmarried women. For married women, we also see kind of about like an 8 percentage point increase in the share that believe is appropriate for married women to use phones with family supervision. And then what you can see on the right-hand side is that there are, sort of smaller increases in the share that believe that unsupervised phone use is appropriate. This is still something that is generally frowned upon in this part of India, but simply receipt of this phone via this large government program shifts these stated beliefs in the short run. I should say I'm going to, for time, skip through. There's also evidence that people start using phones more, both men and women, after the program, though those gains are much smaller than kind of the gains in access that you see on the first slide. But I think the norm story is not entirely straightforward in the short run, because kind of alongside this liberalization of, people saying, oh, sure, it's, potentially appropriate for a woman to use a phone. What we see among men is about a 6 to 8 percentage point increase in the share of men who agree with the statement that men have more use for a phone, despite like kind of no change in the stated beliefs of wives. So I think this kind of raises the question of, what's going to happen in the longer term as, women kind of have the opportunity to demonstrate their returns to this new technology and other members of the household can experiment with that new technology. And I think for us also raises the possibility of, well, maybe in addition to kind of giving stuff out, you need to have the use case. So really bundling those two things together. So alongside, the sort of evaluation of Sky, one of the things I'm working on, which after many delays due to COVID, is going to finally, we're collecting data in the field, hopefully within the next few weeks, starting to answer these questions, is a randomized trial that we designed to really dissect those various barriers to phone ownership and, kind of understand, get a window into how norms around use of technology change. And so the idea is to kind of build on Project Sky as a platform. And then say, if we start by just easing this economic constraint of not having access to phones, what if we layer on top in kind of tiered combinations so we can isolate the effect of different interventions? First, just like a very basic training designed to address issues of digital illiteracy, which is going to affect the returns to using the technology. So that's a picture of us piloting the training. On top of that, we actually worked to build on our own kind of a female-centric use case for phones, which we call Morawaz, which means my voice in Chhattisgarhi. And effectively, this is a service that calls women once a week with a pre-recorded message, kind of related to either health or receipt of government benefits. And then every month, we do a kind of person-to-person survey with the women to collect data on various topics, aggregate that and share it with the government. So it's kind of meant to be a way of connecting citizens to both information and the state, while very explicitly targeting it to women. Among those MORWA's beneficiaries, we vary economic returns to women's phone use by varying incentives to participate in the service and respond to these calls. And we also vary the share of women within communities that are enrolled in the service to start to understand how, kind of perceived engagement within the community translates into stated norms. And so I can't share results with that because it's pending, but this is kind of where this is going. And essentially, like in terms of takeaways, what do we sort of know about this right now? The first is that in a number of emerging economies, I think particularly in South Asia and parts of sub-Saharan Africa, restrictive norms, lack of agency may limit women's participation in the digital economy. And I think this is a major issue, both from a business as well as, just like a development perspective. And I think it's important to engage with not just building things for women, but thinking about the social norms that affect their ability to interact with these technologies. And there does appear to be scope for policy to shift norms and behavior when well designed. I think the key question we have from the short run results of the MORWA's evaluation is, does this potentially induce backlash, and what happens over the longer term? The convenient thing about this program, it was actually rolled out based on a census population discontinuity within the villages. So we're also planning on conducting a survey around that discontinuity to provide long-term evidence on the effects using a regression discontinuity approach. That's pending. And I think the goal here is to really looking ahead, think about ways that policy and really kind of product offerings can be designed to limit backlash and sort of spur use of women's phones. So, and that's all I have. Thanks very much, everyone.
Great, fantastic. Thank you, Simone. And clearly technology adoption and the broader issues associated with that, especially in the developing world, are really important. So thank you for opening the window into thinking about that set of issues with the work you've described. All right, our third presenter is Amit Seru, who's going to move to something quite different and talk about the iBanker experience and iBroker experience and things in the housing market in the US. So Amit, take it away.
Okay, can you see my slides?
Yep.
Perfect. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, organizers. This is joint work with Greg Buchek, my colleague, Gregor Matos from Northwestern, and Tomek Wyszkowski from Columbia. So this paper is looking at intermediation in the housing market through the lens of a type of dealer called an iBuyer, and trying to uncover the economics that make intermediating housing potentially useful, but also very difficult. The timing is very fortunate for this paper, because if you've been following the news, you've seen that Zillow just exited this business after losing about $300 million. And our paper setting actually predates Zillow's entry into this market. But I think it's very instructive on what happened with Zillow if you look at what we sort of find in the paper, because it's basically out of sample confirmation of economic forces that I'm going to be talking about. Now, I want to start by the observation that liquidity or lack thereof is super important factor when it comes to residential real estate, because households face balance sheet constraints. So if you are looking to move, you don't usually have two houses at the same time. What that means is that if you're trying to move, you can be stuck in your old place before you can get into a new location, a new job, and so on. So that would suggest that it's pretty natural, at least, that we should think about a dealer who can just stand in ready whenever an owner becomes motivated to sell. As natural as it may seem, at least in the US, we haven't seen much of this in practice. Well, pretty much till recently. And we've seen a bunch of intermediaries known as iBuyers who've essentially entered into this market. And they are intermediating anywhere between 5 to 10% of house sales in some markets. And if you look at what they do, they combine or claim to combine a balance sheet capacity, so they can buy assets on demand, with some technology that facilitates this transfer. What that means is that the technology is doing something. And in this paper, we are essentially trying to figure out what that really is. So if you're trying to get a quick overview of what these iBuyers are, like I said, that these are intermediaries who buy your homes instantly and then resell it to the other buyers. So when I say instantly, it's literally possible to go from requesting an offer to closing in a few days. So this essentially entails for the iBuyer to do remote valuation of your homes. They claim using big data and sophisticated models. They make an offer and then they close very quickly. And the biggest iBuyers, if you're interested, are Opendoor, OfferPad, Redfin now, and until recently Zillow, and no longer. Just compare that with brokers who are everywhere, and they don't buy homes and put it on their balance sheet. You're talking about iBuyers who actually buy the houses and then resell them. So just some basic facts about iBuyers, which we uncover in the data, and I'll run you through some of them. Is that, like, if you see where they're active, they're mainly active in cookie cutter homes, so standard sizes, price ranges, features. If you're trying to understand what I'm talking about, think about a prototypical market would be, think about Phoenix. And when they buy a home, they own it for roughly about 90 days, even shorter, and then sell it. And when they buy and sell, in the round trip, they make about 5% gross spread. And this is over and above the usual servicing fee that brokers charge. It's the same for iBuyers as well. So going back, what we are going to do is look at iBuyers as a laboratory to study how durable goods are intermediated, especially goods which are difficult to price, illiquid, and so on. And in doing so, we hope that we are trying to, we'll discover the value of having a dealer in these markets, understand the key underlying frictions that make intermediation really hard. We quantify what these frictions are. And then what we do is sort of see how and what technology can do in this market, because there's a big hype around technology. So we open this box of technology and try to figure out what is it that technology allows you to do and doesn't allow you to do. And in doing so, we are able to understand also the limits of technology and limits to intermediation in this market. So as I'll go along, I'll essentially be talking about three economic forces that emerge that become very important in this market as one tries to understand intermediation. The first is speed. How fast can the seller affect the sale and move on? The second is occupancy. Who is occupying the house and getting the service flows during the transaction when it's happening? And the third is information asymmetry between buyer and seller on non-contractable features of the home. So think about lighting quality, noise in the neighborhood, and so on. And these are non-contractable features, but they do matter. So, when you're thinking about the extremes, think about a homeowner seller. The process there is slow. Potential listing can take 90 days, even more. The housing during the period when this transaction is happening and when the matching is happening is occupied, but it's not occupied by the first best user, because that's why this person wants to move. And when we're thinking about adverse selection, there's limited adverse selection potentially between the owner and seller, because the seller can come in and try to look at these hard to quantify characteristics on their own and then figure out what their valuation is for the home, depending on their own observation. Now, contrast that with the dealer intermediated transaction. The speed is going to be fast because the technology is there. It presumably gets the paperwork done faster, and other things are faster too. Houses during the period when this transaction occurs are not occupied, so service flows are lost. How important are those? We can quantify those. And when you look at information asymmetry, because these intermediaries claim to do remote valuation, there's a potential of adverse selection because you're not essentially looking at the other features which a normal otherwise buyer would potentially look at and get into the pricing. So what are we trying to do here? So I'll give you some basic facts about what we find about iBuyers in this market. And the facts are going to be that they buy fast and at low prices. They tend to be pretty active in liquid markets, and they are very active in easy to price cookie cutter homes. We are going to look at these facts and interpret it through a structural model. I'll just give you a very big picture overview of what this model is. And essentially what's going to emerge from this model is that what these intermediaries are doing is just provide liquidity to motivated sellers. The problem is that while they are providing this liquidity, iBuyers do suffer from significant risks of adverse selection because they hold inventory, and during that time, they could be facing a home which has some bad shock that emerges, which iBuyers may not have uncovered through their earlier valuation when they bought the home. And because they face this risk, this sort of plays into the dynamics of what kind of homes iBuyers want to enter and what kind of markets iBuyers want to enter. The other interesting thing here is that because this is an unused asset when iBuyers are operating, what does that mean in terms of welfare losses? And we can sort of get at that. Now, the model allows us to get at counterfactuals, and there are a couple of lessons which emerge from the model. One is that the balance sheet is not enough. So technology does do something. Transaction speed is important. Valuation technology is important. So if you just had balance sheet, that's not enough in terms of getting a reasonable market share. So that's something that's important. The other thing is that what you see very quickly is, given how the market dynamics are, the growth is going to be limited in markets which are already liquid. So in some sense, they do not bring liquidity to illiquid markets where extra liquidity would have been the most valuable just because of the way their business model is. So like I said, some facts, the model, and a little bit of counterfactual, and hopefully I can do all of this very quickly. I'll skip the setting and data. I've already told you what iBuyers are. We look at the largest markets. We look at time period between 2013 to 2018. That's before Zillow entered, like I said, but it provides us a pretty good window of how these folks operate. So I won't get into the data here, but hopefully you can get that from the paper. So let me get into the facts about iBuyers, which are useful to put on the table. I've already mentioned them, but let me quickly say that again. So the first thing is, they are very fast when buying. On the left, I'm showing you how, when you look at deed records and see who the intermediary was, if you look at iBuyers, what you find is that the listings occur at a much lower rate when the intermediary involved is an iBuyer. And why is that important? Because a typical listing is 90 days at least. So the fact that iBuyers cut out listing means you cut out a bunch of days of transactions, and this is what all iBuyers sort of market when they are trying to entice people to come in and transact with them. What about selling? When it comes to selling, it turns out that they are pretty patient. In fact, more patient than a typical seller. That's the regression on the right. And they are willing to sort of wait it out till they find the reasonable seller who appreciates the home that they have in their inventory. So that's one fact. The second is when it comes to pricing, the standard hedonic model, which is a pricing model based on characteristics of the home, is something that is pretty standard in the housing literature. So one can apply that and account for differences in characteristics of the home, and you can do that. But what you still find when you do that is that when you look at iBuyers, they buy homes at a discount, about 3.5%. And when they sell at a premium of 1.5%. So that's where you get the 5% round trip gross profits that iBuyers make. So just again, this is not the usual brokerage fees of 6% that we are talking about. This is over and above that. This is also not something where when you look at a typical flipper, that iBuyer has a flipping model, they buy homes at a discount, then they renovate, and then they sell. They don't do much renovation. There's not much of that going on, and we sort of look at all of that in the paper. This is not about cutting fees and charging it here. This is over and above that, and that's what we sort of say is charging for convenience because they cut out the hassle. The third important thing is what are the houses and markets where iBuyers are very active. And the way we sort of look at it is on two margins. One is what kind of houses in terms of speed of selling in the market do iBuyers have a higher market share in? And second, if you look at the valuation models and hedonics, in terms of difficult to price homes versus easy to price homes, where do you see iBuyer market share higher or lower? And so the picture on the left is looking at markets where looking at the characteristics of the market well before iBuyers entered, if you classified them as markets which are liquid or illiquid based on how long it takes, and ask the question, how much iBuyer market share there is when they do enter, what you find is that iBuyer market share is much higher in markets where it's much easier to sell, so liquid markets. On the right-hand side is a picture which is telling you, hey, are there markets where it's difficult to price homes based on characteristics of homes before iBuyers entered? And what do you find? That iBuyer market share is much higher in markets where a typical hedonic model based on characteristics would predict the transaction price very, very well. So again, liquid markets very active, and easy to value home markets very active. So given all these facts, the question is, what more can we learn about the frictions in this market, about intermediaries, and what can we learn about the interaction between balance sheet and technology? So that's where the structural model comes in. It helps us quantify these different frictions and helps us disentangle these effects, and then ask the question, what would happen if we tweaked around some of these frictions and looked at what iBuyers may or may not do. So that's what this sort of model does. Very quickly, it's a dynamic continuous time equilibrium model with adverse selection. And so I'm not going to get into gory details here, but the basic point here is that if you look at households, they'll start by becoming unmatched because, let's say, they want to move. Why? Because they got a better job in a different location. Maybe they have kids who want to go into some different schools. The issue is that they are balance sheet constrained, so they must sell the old home before they can move. That's the friction. They don't have a balance sheet. And the problem is that they can do that, but the listing is slow. And if they go through the traditional process, the other option they have is go to the iBuyer. That's pretty quick. And iBuyers have this balance sheet where they can hold this. But there is a wrinkle because the technology comes in and plays a role here. And there are three sets of things in technology that we sort of focus on. One is, how quickly can iBuyers close the transaction? How accurately can they value the house? Because that's going to be that's going to drive adverse selection. And what's their skill in selling the house once they own it? And we are going to tweak around these parameters to sort of see what it does to the market equilibrium. So just to give you a sense of how this market works, well, let's think about a household. They start out being matched in their ideal home, but at some point they become unmatched. At this point, they have to decide whether they want to list themselves or do they want to go to an iBuyer. If they decide to list themselves, they can do that, and they can do the normal traditional listing. If they do that, like, they'll match and there'll be a list price there. We see the data and all of this because there are many homes that go through the traditional route. Or you could go through iBuyer. If you do that, you immediately sell the home. Of course, there's a transaction that happens. What is the transaction that we are talking about? Here, you got to worry about the iBuyer setting a price. And there are a bunch of dimensions of technology that come in. One is, how quickly do you close? Second is, how and what is the valuation noise that the iBuyer will get, because relative to the normal seller, iBuyer is doing a quick valuation. So there's going to be valuation noise, and that is what drives the potential for adverse selection. And the third thing where technology might come in is the match rate between the iBuyer and the buyer when they're selling the home to someone. And once the home has been sold and the seller becomes a buyer, and the circle of life then continues back again. So that's the thesis of what the dynamic model tries to do. And we look for an equilibrium which has a bunch of state variables and calibrated with data that I sort of talked about before. So going back to the three things that I talked about before in terms of the attributes that we look at, what we sort of again do here is, when you look about households, they are slow in terms of the transaction, how it takes place. It's occupied, even though not by the first best, and there is limited adverse selection. In contrast, if you look at a dealer, it's pretty fast, it's unoccupied, and it has a potential for adverse selection. So now what can we do? We can tweak around or toggle these things and see how important they are. And that's what we sort of do. So the first thing we do is, suppose we looked at the data given our model and we made the iBuyers become slow. What would that do to their market share? That's what's being plotted on the right-hand side. So the baseline is what is in the data, but suppose you made them slower, what do you find? Well, if the iBuyers are slow, there is no reason to go to iBuyers, and their market share plummets. Not a surprise, good to see. What happens if you, during the time when they don't occupy, you did allow some kind of renting. Think about Airbnb, which is not the current model, but you could imagine that model comes in. What you find is that the market share of iBuyers increases because the occupancy that's valuable, they can monetize that, pass some of that to the homeowners, and that's pretty useful. So that's, again, something that is nice to see, that this margin also matters. The third thing is related to the valuation precision, and that's where adverse selection comes in. And so suppose your pricing technology is bad, what will that do? That will depress market share significantly, because the intuition here is that sellers in this market are price sensitive enough that if there is valuation noise, iBuyers are going to offer a pool price, knowing that they'll face adverse selection. That'll drive out a lot of good sellers, and that's going to sort of cut down on their market share. That's what's basically happening here. So this is something that tells us that things are sort of progressing in ways that we would imagine. So then we use the model to do counterfactuals. And what counterfactuals do? We do two counterfactuals. The first one is, how important is the iBuyers technology in addition to the balance sheet capacity? So let's say we talked about Berkshire Hathaway as an intermediary. Is that going to be enough? No, what turns out is that transaction speed and valuation accuracy are jointly necessary. Otherwise, there is no advantage to selling them, because you can find other intermediaries who can do similar kind of stuff. The counterfactual that I want to show you very quickly, though, is what happens in terms of thinking about iBuyers liquidity provision. Which markets are they going to benefit? What are the limits of iBuyer liquidity? And what is the role of adverse selection here? And what we sort of do is perturb the matching parameter, the matching rate between iBuyer and buyer, and sort of see what it does to different margins. So the first thing what we find is, if you look at in the picture here, the x-axis here is telling you what is happening to liquidity. So more time it takes to sell means lower liquidity. And what you find is iBuyer market share sort of goes down as anticipated. Why is that happening? One is, if it takes more time to sell, there is an empty home. And I already told you that occupancy is important in terms of welfare losses. So that comes to bite. The second thing is that the more time it is on the market with the iBuyer, the more the chance of adverse selection. So what do I have in mind? It's something like this, that like if it takes you longer time, what is going to end up happening is iBuyers are mistakenly going to buy more bad homes. And the intuition is that, if there are bad things that occur to the home, that means iBuyers are not going to be able to sell them. And if you keep on holding this for a long time, that leads to more adverse selection, because good types leave. You anticipate that as an iBuyer. That means you're not going to offer a high price. If you don't offer a high price, good sellers leave, and so on. So there is a vicious cycle here. Here, what I have plotted is, in the model, we sort of model adverse selection as potentially bad things happening to your home the longer you hold it. And what this is showing you is that indeed, like as you hold the thing for a longer time, given that your valuation is not perfect as an iBuyer, your technology has some noise, you are going to be hit with some bad noise the longer you hold it. So it's a pretty simple intuition, but it's nice to see that it actually quantitatively matters. And the last thing we sort of focus on is, hey, what does it do in terms of ex-post liquidity? So iBuyers they enter into the most liquid markets, but what do they do to the liquidity after they enter the market? And turns out that they are basically going to enter and make the biggest impact in markets where liquidity is the highest to begin with. And therefore, it's not going to matter much for ex-post liquidity. So again, on the x-axis is liquidity in terms of time to sale. Higher time means lower liquidity. And what you find is that the iBuyer reduction of time to sale is the largest in most liquid markets, which is what I was sort of telling you. So to conclude, iBuyers provide speed and mobility to households, and as a result are able to charge premium for convenience. What this tells you is that the dealers in this market face two possible frictions, which are both quantitatively important. One is if you keep the house unoccupied, that's a major loss. And second is if you keep it on your balance sheet, you're exposed to a big adverse selection. What that tells you is that iBuyers are not just about balance sheet. They bring in technology, but because the technology has issues in terms of having a valuation error, there is adverse selection. So while technology is important, balance sheet is not important, not enough. There is the notion that adverse selection makes this a problem in terms of how big iBuyers could actually get. So you're adding liquidity in an already liquid market because you're valuing it remotely, offering convenience to the consumer. The big picture here is that the technology here is sort of creating new products, but so it's convenience here, not lower costs. But of course, all of this is telling you that balance sheet intermediation of consumption good is not that easy. Technology can do a bunch of stuff. Balance sheet is important, but if it's illiquid asset, it's hard to price, and if there is a high utilization value, it's going to limit how and what technology can do. And I leave you with this last thought on Zillow. Like I said, it basically shut down its iBuyer business. And if you look at what the CEO came out and said, first they said we've determined that there is big forecasting errors in our pricing algorithm, which is what the basis of this paper is in terms of what we think. And the second is there's a lot of adverse selection, not just the adverse selection that we talked about, but there was even other kinds of adverse selection. There were other flippers who were buying homes quicker. And as a result, Zillow tried to buy from them, and that led to other kinds of adverse selection. And the bottom line here is intermediating houses is quite difficult, which hopefully I have conveyed to you reasonably clearly. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you all. Amit, I just want to ask you one question on your very last slide. Given that we've been in a rising housing market, an extraordinarily rising housing market in the US for the last year, does that suggest any more about how hard it is? Does Zillow's action suggest anything more about just how hard it must be to make this work? You would have thought that if you were long housing for some period of time, a few months, through the last year, this would be a pretty good time to be in that position.
Yeah, Jim, that's exactly right. So it's pretty stunning that in this high increasing house price market, Zillow has made losses. And I think the reason is it's a little bit outside the model. They, of course, faced adverse selection because their model had error and so on. But, we are talking about increasing market. So errors should be okay. They are one directional. The problem is, if you look at the main listing channel and other iBuyers and flippers, they started buying quite quickly. And Zillow, being a late entrant, tried to gain market share. And one way in which it decided to gain market share is buy quickly and buy non-cookie cutter homes. And that's, I think, a recipe of disaster. Yeah. And I think that's what basically it seems like has happened here.
Got it. Okay. All right. I think there are a couple of questions, Amit, for you in the chat, but we only have just a couple of minutes left. I think I'm going to ask each of Rebecca, then Simone, and then back to you, Amit, if you would like to expand on any of the comments that you've been providing in the chat, but we're not going to open for general discussion. I think that's probably our best bet to stay on time. So Rebecca, do you want to start and respond or highlight anything that anyone said to you?
I think I mostly put it in the chat, but I guess there was a question about trying to understand this sort of more broadly, why women accrue less experience than men. We have a hard time sort of looking at that, in our paper directly, just because this is a pervasive thing across, basically in any industry you look at, you see this weaker labor market attachment and fewer hours per week. And I think it's a sort of definitely, I think our results highlight that in trying to understand better these long run, sort of over the whole life cycle differences in hours choices by men and women. What are, the key, sticking points that are creating those? Is it more on the household time use side? Are there more labor market policies that are contributing to that? I think understanding those forces is sort of where we need to go to try to mitigate the differential return to the impact of this differential experience accumulation. I think that's hard to answer in the Uber context because we don't really see much about these workers other than exactly what they're doing when they're on the Uber platform. But I agree, it's, I would be super interested to know more there.
Yeah, no, I thought your framework of thinking about what technologies and flexibility they bring can and can't do when the labor market returns are, it's a fantastic way to think about this problem. Simone, over to you. Any parting thoughts?
I don't think I have too much more. I think I covered the question in the chat, which was asking about gender differences in phone use. But I think for sure there are also, major gaps both on the extensive as well as the intensive margin. It's not just, ownership and households owning owning one phone, but it really is, I think, like a fundamental technology adoption problem that is sort of, mediated by both market forces and norms. And so I think that's the way we'll be approaching things as the project life cycle continues.
No, thank you, and look forward to seeing all the additional results that are in train that you mentioned as you passed. So Amit, back over to you for the last word.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a bunch of questions about adverse selection, how big it is. Does 5 to 10% market share for iBuyers, as some people are estimating, seem reasonable? And could Zillow have known that there's such a big market of lemons that they are creating? I think, I think 5 to 10%, our model says in some markets is possible, because given the current valuation technology and the error that we estimate, 5 to 10 is optimistic. Could Zillow have predicted all of this? I think they could have at least tried to stay within the cookie cutter bounds. The fact that they went to non-cookie cutter homes is already a telltale sign that they did not think that adverse selection is a major deal in this market. And I think it came back to bite them pretty bad. I think Mike has some really good suggestion, which I think we can do, which is seeing, can you back out beliefs that Zillow had, which were inaccurate? I think we can absolutely do that. So yeah. Thanks, everyone.
All right, we have hit the ending time for our session exactly on the nose. So I want to thank our three presenters for really interesting presentations. Great to hear about the exciting work that you're doing. I want to thank Mike Luca, who's with us, for facilitating and helping to organize and to bring the NBER session onto the NABE Tech platform this year. We're really pleased to do that. And of course, Chris Jonas and Tom Beers and all those who are at NABE and making this happen. So thank you all very much. And we look forward to seeing you again, I hope, at NABE Tech next year, perhaps in person. So take care.